In Martin Scorsese's film, The Irishman, there's a scene where Russell Bufalino says,
"If they can whack a president, they can whack a president of a union. You know it, and I know it."
This line nods to a long-standing conspiracy theory that the Mafia played a role in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The Irishman was based on the book I Heard You Paint Houses by Charles Brandt, which discusses the life of Frank Sheeran and the hits he took part in working with the Bufalino crime family. Sheeran even claims that he delivered 3 rifles to Dallas in the days leading up to the president's assassination, which turned out to be the same kind of guns used in the shooting. This naturally piqued my interest, as I'm sure it's already piquing yours, and as I began my research, I quickly discovered there was something here worth talking about. So, in today's video, we will investigate the potential role of the Mafia in John F. Kennedy's assassination. Early links between JFK and the Mafia. Before looking at the tragic events of November 22nd, 1963, it's important to understand the earlier relationships between the Kennedys and the Mafia. The Kennedy family had indirect ties to organized crime even before JFK became president. It is alleged that during the 1960 election, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., who is JFK's father, reached out to the Mafia for help in securing his son's victory in the primaries. Numerous accounts, including later investigative reports, claim that mob boss Sam Giancana and other gangsters provided critical support for JFK's campaign. For example, FBI wiretaps and other sources indicated that the Chicago Mafia under Giancana was active in JFK's Illinois campaign, helping with financial backing and even ballot stuffing. Illinois was a pivotal state that Kennedy won by an extremely narrow margin, fewer than 9,000 votes. So why would the Mafia help JFK get elected? According to Robert G. Blakely, a former Justice Department special prosecutor, mob bosses expected a friendly relationship or payback if Kennedy won. Mafia leaders believed that the Kennedys would do something for them, specifically regarding FBI pressure on their activities. In other words, they hoped JFK would go easy on organized crime in return for their assistance. Giancana in particular was known to have connections to JFK through a mistress, Judith Campbell, who was romantically linked to both men. If the Mafia did help JFK, however, it turned out to be a bad bargain for the mob. After Kennedy took office, he appointed his brother Robert F. Kennedy as Attorney General, and Bobby Kennedy, RFK's nickname, launched an unprecedented legal assault on organized crime. Far from easing off, the Kennedy Justice Department intensified pressure. Grand juries were convened, indictments of mobsters and their allies like Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa multiplied, and high-profile investigations targeted Mafia kingpins across the country. One journalist noted that previous attorney generals had often declared war on the mob, but quote, Robert Kennedy was the first to fight one. To Mafia bosses, it felt like a betrayal. They, allegedly, helped JFK win the primary expecting leniency, only to find the new administration turning on them with a vengeance. This planted the seeds of resentment and, some speculate, a motive for retaliation. Government collaboration with organized crime. Another piece of context we need is the fact that the US government agencies themselves had collaborated with Mafia figures in the early 1960s. This may sound far-fetched, but it is now well documented that in the era of the Cold War and Cuban tensions, the CIA secretly enlisted mobsters in plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. According to declassified CIA documents, one 1960 plan to kill Castro involved notable American mobsters John Rossellini, Sam Giancana, and Santo Trafficante. These mob bosses were approached by CIA contacts for the removal of Fidel Castro. It was Giancana who even suggested poisoning Castro. The agency even offered $150,000, which is $1.6 million in today's money, for the assassination. This collaboration was kept top secret. Even the Warren Commission investigating JFK's death was never even told that the CIA had been working with the Mafia on assassination plots abroad. So why does this matter? Well, for one, it demonstrates that the CIA believed that the Mafia had the means and expertise to carry out covert assassinations, even against well-guarded targets. It also means that in 1963, the Mafia had established contact within the CIA. Historical precedent for government-mafia collaboration goes back even further. During World War II, US Navy intelligence famously struck a deal with New York Mafia bosses like Charles Lucky Luciano to secure the docks and aid the invasion of Sicily, a covert program codenamed Operation Underworld. So, by the 1960s, there was already a pattern of partnership between the mob and government agencies. This does not prove that the mob killed JFK, of course, but it shows that such an alliance between the mob and CIA was not implausible at that time. Something worth noting, given that a lot of conspiracy theories pin the assassination of JFK on the CIA. Why would the Mafia want JFK dead? By 1963, several powerful Mafia bosses felt directly threatened by JFK's administration. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had put top mobsters on trial and even had one, Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, deported to Central America in 1961 as an illegal immigrant. Marcello had to bribe his way back into the country and was enraged at the humiliating kidnapping, as he called it. Chicago's Sam Giancana, who allegedly helped JFK win Illinois, became another prime target of the Justice Department's crackdown. Santo Trafficante, the Florida mob boss, was likewise under federal scrutiny. And Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters union leader, deeply entangled with organized crime, was being relentlessly pursued by the Kennedy administration. For the Mafia, JFK and his brother represented an existential threat. The stakes were high: prison or even deportation. In September 1962, Carlos Marcello was asked what he planned to do about Bobby Kennedy's harassment. Marcello allegedly responded in Sicilian slang, "Levarsi na pietra di la scarpa." I'm sorry for my pronunciation, I tried my best, but what it does translate to is "take the stone out of my shoe," meaning to remove the source of his irritation. When Marcello was warned that killing the Attorney General could provoke the wrath of the president, Marcello clarified, saying, quote, "If you want to kill a dog, you don't cut off the tail, you cut off the head." In other words, to get rid of Bobby Kennedy, you had to take out President Kennedy, and in that way, Robert Kennedy would lose his power. Marcello added that he would use a quote nut, someone crazy or a fall guy, to do the job. This conversation, recounted by an FBI informant years later, sounds almost too perfectly predictive of what eventually happened. JFK was shot by what appeared to be a lone crazy gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. Whether or not anyone believes this account from the FBI informant, it highlights the very real hatred Mafia bosses had towards the Kennedys. Another mob figure, Santo Trafficante, reportedly made a chilling comment years afterwards. On his deathbed in 1987, Trafficante confided to his lawyer, Frank Reggiano, quote, "Carlos fucked up. We should not have killed Giovanni. We should have killed Bobby." If true, Trafficante's alleged statement is one man's word, but Reggiano stood by it. By late 1963, mob bosses like Marcello, Giancana, and Trafficante had ample reason to kill Kennedy. As one Senate investigator later put it, quote, "In the universe of the Kennedy assassination, the mob loomed as the sun." Lee Harvey Oswald's connections to the Mafia. A key question is whether Lee Harvey Oswald had any link, direct or indirect, to the Mafia. Oswald is often characterized as a lone drifter, a former Marine and Marxist who spent time in the Soviet Union. On the surface, he seems far removed from organized crime. However, investigators have uncovered some intriguing connections between Oswald and the Mafia, particularly in New Orleans, where Oswald lived in 1963. It turns out Oswald had an uncle named Charles Dutz Moret, who was involved in the New Orleans gambling racket. Moret wasn't a made man, meaning he wasn't a full member of the Mafia, but he did work for a prominent bookmaker named Sam Saya, described by the Metropolitan Crime Commission as the most powerful operator of illegal handbooks in New Orleans. Illegal handbooks meaning betting operations. Sam Saya was a lieutenant of Carlos Marcello. This means Oswald grew up around an uncle connected in Marcello's network. In fact, a statement made by Marcello stated that, quote, "Oswald, I used to know his fucking family. His uncle, he worked for me. The kid worked for me too." According to testimony gathered years later, Oswald himself may have done small jobs for Saya's bookmaking operation. There is evidence suggesting that in the summer of 1963, when Oswald was back in New Orleans, he worked as a runner at a French Quarter establishment called Felix's Oyster House, one of Sam Saya's betting parlors. A runner would typically carry bets or cash between the locations and the central bookkeeping hub. If this testimony is accurate, Oswald was on the fringes of Marcelo's criminal empire shortly before he went to Dallas. It places him, at least somewhat, in the scope of organized crime figures, pun intended. Another link is Oswald's association with David W. Ferry, a former airline pilot and eccentric anti-Castro activist in New Orleans. Ferry also happened to work for Carlos Marcelo's attorney as an investigator, and he had known ties to the mob boss. In the 1950s, Ferry was a captain in the Civil Air Patrol in New Orleans, and Lee Harvey Oswald, as a teenager, was one of his cadets. Multiple witnesses later testified that Oswald and Ferry met again in the summer of 1963, where they were allegedly seen together at a voter registration drive in Clinton, Louisiana. Ferry's possible role in the Kennedy assassination plot became a focus of New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison's controversial investigation, which was later dramatized in Oliver Stone's JFK. While Garrison's broader conspiracy case was not proven, the Oswald-Ferry connection is well established. Some researchers believe Ferry could have been a handler linking Oswald to the mob. At the very least, Oswald wasn't as isolated from the mob as many thought. He had family and acquaintances with Mafia ties. It's important to note that none of this definitively proves Oswald was recruited by the Mafia, but it does challenge the notion that Oswald had no possible connection with the Mafia. G. Robert Blakely, the former chief counsel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, pointed out that Oswald's mob ties in Louisiana were significant. Oswald's uncle was in Marcelo's network, and Oswald himself moved in circles that overlapped with mob interests. Oswald could have been the nut that Marcelo talked about using, a troubled young man with tangible mob connections that made him a convenient tool. The lingering question is whether he was truly alone or influenced by others behind the scenes. Jack Ruby's Mafia ties. The next major figure in the JFK saga is Jack Ruby, the Dallas nightclub owner who abruptly killed Oswald 2 days after the assassination. Ruby shooting Oswald at point blank on live television silenced Oswald forever. This single event is what keeps conspiracy theories alive today. It looked very much like Ruby was shutting Oswald up before he could talk. So who was Jack Ruby, and did he have Mafia ties? The answer is yes. Ruby was deeply connected to the criminal underworld. Ruby had been involved in running nightclubs, strip joints, and even possibly minor rackets in Dallas, and he rubbed shoulders with mob-affiliated individuals regularly. In Dallas, the local mafia boss was Joseph Savello. Ruby knew Savello and reportedly had dealings with him. More significantly, Ruby was close friends with Joseph Campisi, who was Savello's number 2 man. Campisi and Ruby were so friendly that Ruby ate dinner at Campisi's restaurant, the Egyptian Lounge, the night before JFK was assassinated. After Ruby was imprisoned for killing Oswald, Campisi was a regular visitor to his jail cell. This is hardly a random coincidence. In fact, a lot of Ruby's contacts read like a who's who of mob associates. When Robert Kennedy looked over the record of Ruby's pre-assassination phone calls, he said that, quote, "The list was almost a duplicate of the people I called before the Rackets Committee." It's clear that Jack Ruby had extensive mafia connections. All of this lends weight to the idea that Ruby killed Oswald to protect the larger conspiracy. The HSCA investigation in the late 1970s came to exactly that conclusion. The committee found that Ruby stalked Oswald on behalf of organized crime, attempting to get close to him several times in the 48 hours after JFK's assassination, before ultimately shooting him point blank on live television. G. Robert Blakely and his team uncovered evidence that Ruby had numerous suspicious encounters and phone calls in the days surrounding the event. He was seen trying to gain access to Oswald when he was being transferred. This pattern suggests that Ruby was not just trying to avenge Kennedy, as he famously claimed, but rather Ruby could have been acting under pressure or orders from mob contacts, essentially to silence Oswald before he could implicate anybody. If Oswald truly had no accomplices and no mob ties, then why would a connected mob associate like Ruby be so determined to kill him? It's hard to ignore that organized crime figures could have potentially been involved in at least the demise of Oswald, if not JFK's. Evidence and allegations of Mafia involvement in JFK's death. Is there any direct evidence that exists that the Mafia planned or even carried out the assassination of President Kennedy? Well, over the years, several pieces of evidence and testimony have emerged, though much of it does remain circumstantial or disputed, such as the alleged confessions by Mafia figures. On top of Santo Traficante's supposed deathbed confession that we talked about earlier, there are claims that Carlos Marcello himself admitted involvement. An FBI informant in the 1980s reported that Marcello, in a fit of anger, said, quote, "Yeah, I had that little son of a bitch killed," in reference to JFK. However, this was never recorded on tape, but the informant's account was deemed credible enough that it is cited in multiple investigations. Likewise, Frank Sheeran, the Irishman and mob hitman, implied he had knowledge of the Mafia's role in the assassination. In the book, I Heard You Paint Houses, Sheeran detailed that just days before the assassination, he delivered high-powered rifles to a location in Dallas. The mysterious deaths. Another often cited point is the pattern of mob-related figures dying in suspicious ways after the assassination. For example, Sam Giancana was assassinated in 1975, shot while cooking in his own kitchen, just days before he was scheduled to testify to the church committee about CIA Mafia plots. Similarly, John Roselli, who had been a part of those Castro plots and later hinted at Mafia knowledge of JFK's murder, was found dead in 1976, stuffed in an oil drum floating off of Miami. Roselli had recently testified to Congress and told investigative reporter Jack Anderson that Castro and Traficante might have struck a bargain to kill Kennedy using rogue Cuban exiles, with Oswald set up as a decoy. Whether or not Roselli's story was true, the timing and manner of his death suggested that he could have been silenced. House Select Committee on Assassinations findings. The US government did take a second look at the JFK case in the 70s. The HSCA re-examined evidence and concluded in 1979 that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. Importantly, while the committee could not pin the conspiracy on one group, it stated it could not exclude the possibility that individual members of organized crime were involved. The committee stopped short of officially naming Marcello or others as co-conspirators, but in private, many staffers leaned towards that conclusion. As Blakely wrote a decade later, "But after 2 years of investigation, we found ourselves differing sharply from the Warren Commission on the central question. We had found seemingly irrefutable scientific evidence of 2 shooters in Daley Plaza. And we had found that the most plausible explanation for the murder of Oswald by Jack Ruby was that Ruby had stalked him on behalf of organized crime, trying to reach him on at least 3 separate occasions in the 48 hours before he silenced him forever. The evidence had to be faced. It was probable that the president had been killed as a result of a conspiracy." The scenario that mob bosses conspired to kill the President of the United States is not as implausible as it once sounded. They had strong motives, and in their world, violence was an accepted solution to problems. The Kennedys, in the eyes of these specific mob bosses, were perceived as having double-crossed them, and the only answer to that, in their eyes, was death. The question of the Mafia's role in JFK's assassination remains one of the most compelling and controversial in modern American history. Even government investigators in the 1970s acknowledged that elements of organized crime were likely involved in a conspiracy. It is certainly possible to imagine a scenario in which Carlos Marcello and other mob bosses, feeling cornered by the Kennedy administration, decided to remove their problem by the means they knew best. On the other hand, we must also admit that hard proof is difficult to find. The Mafia is, by its nature, secretive. If they did organize the assassination, they succeeded in doing so without leaving a smoking gun. Again, pun intended. In the absence of hard evidence, all we have to go on is the alleged deathbed confessions of mob bosses and the statements of FBI informants, all of which is hearsay. Perhaps in 100 or so years, when everyone tied to the assassination of JFK is dead and buried, we may finally get a glimpse at what went on behind the curtain. But until then, I'm Ghostnook, and until next time, thank you for watching.